Most people don't realize they're trapped until it's too late, and by then, the cage feels too comfortable to escape. Ethan Carter was one of those people. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., his alarm would ring, the same dull tone echoing through his small apartment in downtown Chicago. He would reach over, silence it, and lie there for a few seconds staring at the ceiling, already feeling tired before the day even began. Then he would get up, brush his teeth, pour a cup of black coffee, and put on the same style of button-down shirt he had worn almost every weekday for the past 3 years. By 7:15 a.m., he would be out the door, walking the same 6 blocks to the train station, passing the same coffee shop, the same street corner, the same people rushing by with their heads down. Everything in his life was predictable, stable, and safe. And yet, something inside him felt off. At work, Ethan sat in a gray cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building, staring at a computer screen for 8 hours a day. He answered emails, updated spreadsheets, and attended meetings that all sounded the same. His coworkers often said he was lucky. Good job, steady income, benefits, they would remind him. And Ethan would nod, forcing a small smile, telling himself they were right. Because on paper, his life looked perfect. But every now and then, in quiet moments, a strange feeling would creep in. It wasn't pain, and it wasn't sadness. It was something deeper, harder to explain. It felt like emptiness slowly spreading through his chest. One evening, after a long day at work, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the soft hum of the city outside his window. He turned on the TV but didn't really watch. He scrolled through his phone but didn't really see. Then, without warning, a thought entered his mind, simple but unsettling. What if this is it? He paused. What if this routine, this safe and predictable life, is all I will ever have? The question lingered, echoing louder than the noise outside. For the first time, Ethan didn't push it away. He let it sit there, heavy and uncomfortable. And as he stared into the quiet room, he began to realize something he had never allowed himself to see before. Maybe the life he thought was protecting him was actually holding him back. The next morning, Ethan woke up before his alarm even had a chance to ring. His eyes opened slowly, but this time, something felt different. That question from the night before was still there, sitting quietly in the back of his mind. What if this is it? He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a random thought, nothing more. But as he got out of bed and went through his usual routine, everything felt heavier. The coffee did not taste the same. The silence in his apartment felt louder. Even the walk to the train station seemed longer than usual. As he stepped onto the crowded train, surrounded by people staring at their phones, he suddenly noticed something he had never paid attention to before. No one looked happy. Everyone looked tired, distant, almost disconnected from the moment they were in. It was as if they were all moving, but going nowhere at the same time. Ethan stood there, holding onto the metal pole, and for the first time, he saw himself in them. When he arrived at the office, the day unfolded just like every other day. Emails. Meetings. Numbers. Conversations that meant nothing. But now, something had changed. Every task felt like a question instead of an answer. Why am I doing this? Where is this leading me? At one point, his manager walked by and casually said, "Keep this up and you could be looking at a promotion next year." Normally, that would have made Ethan feel proud. But this time, it made his chest tighten. A promotion meant more responsibility, more hours, more of the same life he was already unsure about. He forced a polite smile, but inside, the thought grew louder. Is this really what I want? Later that afternoon, Ethan took a short break and walked to the window. From the 14th floor, the city looked alive. Cars moving, people walking, life happening everywhere. Yet somehow, he felt completely separate from it all. Like he was watching life instead of living it. His reflection in the glass caught his attention. For a moment, he just stared at himself. Then a quiet voice inside him asked something he had been avoiding for years. When did you stop choosing your life and start settling for it? The question hit deeper than anything before. Ethan did not have an answer. And that scared him. Because for the first time, he realized it was not the job, or the city, or the routine that made him feel trapped. It was the choices he had made to stay comfortable, to avoid risk, to play it safe. That evening, instead of turning on the television, Ethan sat in silence. The room felt the same, but he did not. The comfort that once felt reassuring now felt like a quiet pressure, slowly closing in. And deep down, he knew something had already started to change. He just did not know yet how far it would take him. The following day, Ethan could not ignore it anymore. The questions in his mind had grown louder, sharper, impossible to silence. As he sat at his desk, staring at the same spreadsheet he had opened hundreds of times before, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he did not type. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked around. Everything was exactly where it had always been. The same gray walls, the same quiet hum of computers, the same routine playing out around him. But now, it all felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, like he had just woken up inside a life he never consciously chose. His coworker Mark leaned over and said something about a deadline, but Ethan barely heard him. His mind was somewhere else. A memory surfaced without warning. It was from years ago, when he was younger, standing at the edge of a hiking trail in Colorado, looking out at a vast open landscape. He remembered how alive he felt in that moment, how the air felt different, how his heart was racing not from fear, but from possibility. Back then, he had dreams of exploring, of trying new things, of building a life that felt meaningful. But somewhere along the way, those dreams had been replaced with plans that felt safe, practical, responsible. He had told himself he would take risks later, when the timing was right, when he felt ready. But now, sitting in that chair, he realized something that unsettled him deeply. That moment never came. Ethan looked back at his screen, then at his reflection in the dark monitor. A quiet thought formed, clearer than ever before. If I do not change something now, nothing will ever change. His heart began to beat faster, not from excitement, but from fear. Because for the first time, the idea of staying the same felt more frightening than the idea of stepping into the unknown. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every conversation felt distant, every task meaningless. By the time evening arrived, Ethan felt mentally exhausted, even though he had done almost nothing. When he got home, he did not turn on the television. He did not check his phone. He just sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, letting the silence fill the room. Then slowly, almost without thinking, he reached for his laptop. His hands hesitated for a moment before opening it. He typed a few words into the search bar, then stopped. His mind was racing with doubt. What if I fail? What if I make the wrong decision? What if I lose everything I have worked for? The questions came one after another, each one pulling him back toward the safety of his current life. But then another thought appeared, quieter but stronger. What if I stay? The room felt still as that question settled in. Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers resting on the keyboard. For the first time in a long time, he was standing at a real crossroads. Not a small decision, not a temporary change, but something that could redefine everything. And deep down, he knew that whatever he chose next would determine the direction of his life. That night, Ethan did not sleep much. He lay in bed, staring into the darkness, his mind replaying the same thoughts over and over again. Every path he imagined led to uncertainty. Every possibility came with risk. Yet staying where he was no longer felt like safety. It felt like slowly fading into a life he did not choose. The next morning, everything moved in slow motion. He got dressed, walked to the train, and arrived at the office just like always. But this time, there was a quiet tension inside him, like something was about to break. As he sat down at his desk, he looked at his computer screen, then at the stack of papers beside him, then at the clock on the wall. The seconds ticked by, steady and indifferent. For years, he had followed this rhythm without question. But now, each passing second felt like a reminder. Time is moving whether you act or not. His heart started to race. He could feel it in his chest, stronger than usual. His hands felt slightly unsteady. He tried to focus on his work, but the words on the screen blurred together. Then, without fully thinking it through, he stood up. The movement surprised even him. He looked around. No one noticed. Everyone was busy, locked into their own routines. For a brief moment, doubt rushed in. What are you doing? Sit back down. Be smart. Do not ruin everything. But then another voice, calmer but more certain, responded. If not now, then when? Ethan took a slow breath. His decision was not loud or dramatic. It did not come with clarity or confidence. It came with fear, hesitation, and a quiet understanding that waiting longer would only make it harder. Step by step, he walked toward his manager's office. Each step felt heavier than the last. His mind tried to pull him back, reminding him of the paycheck, the stability, the life he had built. But something deeper kept pushing him forward. When he reached the door, he paused. His hand hovered in the air for a second before he knocked. A voice from inside said, "Come in." Ethan opened the door and stepped inside. The room felt smaller than usual. His manager looked up, slightly surprised. Ethan sat down, his heart pounding so loudly it almost drowned out his thoughts. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched. Then finally he spoke. His voice was not strong, but it was steady enough. "I think it is time for me to move on." The words hung in the air. As soon as he said them, a wave of fear rushed through him. There was no taking it back now. His manager leaned back, surprised, asking questions, trying to understand. But Ethan barely heard the details. Something inside him had already shifted. When he walked out of that office, nothing around him had changed, yet everything felt different. The hallway, the desks, the people, all the same. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not certainty, not relief, but a strange mix of fear and freedom, existing at the same time. And as he stood there, holding that feeling, he realized that stepping out of comfort did not feel safe at all. It felt uncertain, unstable, and completely unknown. But it also felt real in a way his old life never did. The moment Ethan stepped out of the building, the air felt different. It was the same city, the same streets, the same noise of cars and distant conversations, but something inside him had changed. For a few seconds he just stood there on the sidewalk, holding his phone in one hand, unsure of what to do next. For years, his life had followed a clear structure. There was always a schedule, a plan, a next step already decided. But now, that structure was gone. And in its place was something unfamiliar. Silence. Freedom. And fear. A quiet voice in his mind started to speak again. "What have you done? You had a stable job. A steady paycheck. A predictable life. Now you have nothing." The words echoed with weight, pulling at his confidence. Ethan began walking without a clear direction, his steps slow and uncertain. The city around him felt louder than usual, almost overwhelming. People passed by him with purpose, heading somewhere, doing something. And for the first time, he felt like he did not belong to that rhythm anymore. Hours passed, and Ethan found himself sitting on a bench in a small park a few blocks away. He watched as a man jogged past him, steady and focused, while a young woman sat nearby reading a book, completely absorbed in her own world. Life was moving everywhere, yet he felt stuck in between. Not part of his old life anymore, but not yet part of anything new. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the growing tension inside him. This was the part no one talks about, he thought. Everyone speaks about change like it is exciting, like it brings instant clarity. But right now, there was no clarity. Only uncertainty. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the park, Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook he had not used in years. It was something he had bought a long time ago, telling himself he would write down ideas, plans, maybe even dreams. But it had remained empty, just like many of the intentions he had once had. He opened it slowly, flipping past the blank pages. Then he paused. For the first time, there was no plan waiting for him. No instructions. No expectations. Just an empty page. His hand hesitated as he held the pen. Doubt returned quickly. What if I cannot figure this out? What if I made a mistake? But then, something quieter pushed through the noise. What if this is the first real chance you have ever had? Ethan looked down at the blank page again. It did not feel like pressure this time. It felt like possibility. Slowly, he lowered the pen and wrote a single sentence. I do not know where this path will lead, but I know I cannot go back. As he read those words, something inside him settled, just slightly. The fear was still there, strong and real. But beneath it, there was something else beginning to grow. Not confidence, not yet. But a willingness to keep moving forward, even without knowing the outcome. And as the last light of the day faded, Ethan realized that stepping out of comfort was not about having all the answers. It was about choosing to continue, even when everything feels uncertain. The next few days felt like stepping into a life without a map. Ethan woke up each morning without an alarm, but instead of feeling relaxed, he felt a quiet pressure in his chest. There was no office to rush to, no schedule telling him what to do next. At first, it felt almost peaceful, like a break he had long needed. But that feeling did not last long. By the third day, the silence began to feel heavier. Without structure, time started to blur. Hours passed without direction, and small doubts slowly turned into louder questions. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop, scrolling through job listings, courses, and ideas, but nothing felt certain. Every option seemed to lead to more questions. What if this path does not work? What if I waste time and fall behind? The fear of making the wrong choice began to creep in again. It was not loud at first, but it stayed, whispering in the background of every decision. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to go for a walk, hoping to clear his mind. The city was alive as always, people moving with purpose, conversations blending into the noise of the streets. But now, instead of feeling like he was outside of it, he noticed something different. Everyone seemed to be following a path they already understood, even if they were not happy with it. It made him wonder if comfort was not just about safety, but about avoiding the responsibility of choosing something uncertain. As he walked past the small bookstore, something caught his attention. In the window, there was a simple sign that read, "A new chapter begins when you turn the page." He paused, reading it again. The words were simple, but they stayed with him. That night, back in his apartment, Ethan opened his notebook again. He flipped to the page where he had written his first sentence, and read it slowly. I do not know where this path will lead, but I know I cannot go back. This time, he did not hesitate as long. He began to write again, not a perfect plan, not a detailed strategy, but small steps. Learn something new. Try something uncomfortable. Talk to people outside your usual circle. The list was not impressive, but it was a start. For the first time since leaving his job, Ethan felt a slight shift. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him completely. Instead of waiting for clarity, he began to understand something important. Clarity does not come before action. It comes after you take the first step. The next morning, Ethan made a simple decision. He would stop waiting for the perfect path and start moving, even if the direction was not clear. He signed up for a short online course, something he had always been curious about but never had the time to explore. It was a small step, almost insignificant compared to the size of his decision to leave his job. But as he completed the first lesson, he felt something shift again, a small sense of progress, a reminder that movement, no matter how small, was better than standing still. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the hardest part of leaving comfort was not the big decision. It was learning how to move forward without knowing exactly where you are going. As the days turned into a week, Ethan began to follow a new rhythm, one that he was slowly creating for himself. Each morning, he sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of coffee, opening his notebook before his laptop. Instead of rushing into tasks, he would write a few simple thoughts. What did I learn yesterday? What can I try today? At first, the answers were small and uncertain. But over time, they became clearer. He continued taking the online course, finishing lesson after lesson, not because he had to, but because he chose to. That alone felt different. But not everything was improving. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the silence returned, heavier than before. Moments when he checked his bank account and felt a wave of anxiety. The numbers were slowly going down, and there was no guarantee they would go back up anytime soon. On those days, doubt came back stronger. What if this does not work? What if I made the wrong decision? One afternoon, Ethan received a message from an old coworker. It was simple. We are hiring again. You could come back. Same position. Maybe even better pay. Ethan stared at the message for a long time. His heart started to beat faster, but not in the same way as before. This time, it felt like a test. A clear path back to safety had just appeared in front of him. No uncertainty. No risk. Just comfort. He imagined what it would feel like to return. The familiar desk. The steady paycheck. The predictable routine. For a brief moment, it felt tempting. Almost too easy. His mind began to list all the reasons why it made sense. Stability. Security. Simplicity. But then, another thought interrupted. And what about the feeling you had before? Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting that question settle. He remembered the emptiness, the quiet dissatisfaction, the sense that something was missing even when everything looked fine. Slowly, he picked up his phone again and read the message one more time. Then, without overthinking, he typed a response. Thank you, but I cannot come back. As soon as he sent it, a wave of fear rushed through him. It was stronger than before, sharper and more immediate. Because this time, he had consciously chosen uncertainty over comfort. There was no one else to blame, no situation forcing his hand. It was his decision. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The same city he had seen every day, but now it felt different again. Not because it had changed, but because he had. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. In that moment, he realized something important. Growth does not happen when things are easy. It happens when you are faced with a choice and you decide to move forward, even when fear is pulling you back. And as he stood there, feeling both uncertain and strangely alive, Ethan understood that he had just crossed another invisible line, one that separated who he used to be from who he was becoming. Weeks passed, and Ethan slowly began to notice something he had not felt in a long time. His days were no longer controlled by a fixed routine, but they were not empty either. They were filled with small actions, intentional choices, and moments of quiet progress. The online course he had started was no longer just a distraction. It had become a daily commitment. He found himself waking up with a reason, not because he had to, but because he wanted to continue what he had started. Still, the journey was far from easy. There were mornings when motivation felt distant, when the uncertainty of his future weighed heavily on him. Some days, he questioned everything again. The fear did not disappear. It changed form. It became more subtle, more persistent, showing up in quiet thoughts like, are you moving fast enough? Are you doing enough? Are you falling behind others your age? One afternoon, while working at a small coffee shop, Ethan overheard a conversation between two strangers sitting nearby. One of them said, I wish I had taken more risks when I was younger. I kept waiting for the perfect time, but it never came. The other person nodded slowly and replied, comfort can be dangerous. It makes you feel safe while slowly taking away your chances. Ethan paused, his hands resting on the table. Those words felt familiar, almost like an echo of his own thoughts. He realized that what he was experiencing was not just about changing jobs or learning something new. It was about changing the way he lived. For years he had believed that comfort meant safety and that safety meant a good life. But now, he was beginning to see something different. Comfort had kept him still. It had kept him from asking questions, from trying, from failing, and from growing. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and stood in front of the mirror. He looked at himself carefully, noticing the subtle changes. There was still uncertainty in his eyes, still traces of doubt. But there was also something else. A sense of awareness, a quiet strength that had not been there before. He was no longer avoiding the hard questions. He was facing them, even when the answers were unclear. He picked up his notebook and flipped through the pages. What started as a single sentence had now grown into multiple entries, each one capturing a moment of learning, a decision made, a fear faced. It was not a perfect journey, but it was real. Ethan sat down and wrote again, slower this time, more intentional. I thought freedom would feel like relief, like everything would suddenly make sense. But it does not feel that way. It feels uncertain. It feels challenging. It feels uncomfortable. Then he paused, thinking carefully before continuing. But it also feels honest. For the first time, I am not hiding behind routine or safety. I am choosing my path, even if I do not fully understand it yet. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, letting that thought settle. In that moment, Ethan realized something that changed how he saw everything. Freedom is not about escaping difficulty. It is about accepting it and still moving forward. And as that understanding took root, he began to see his journey not as a risky decision, but as a necessary one, a path that was shaping him into someone stronger, more aware, and more alive than he had ever been before. Time continued to move forward, and so did Ethan, one small step at a time. What once felt uncertain and overwhelming had slowly become something he could face with more clarity. Not because his path had become easier, but because he had changed. One morning, as he sat by his window with a cup of coffee, watching the early light fill the city, he noticed something simple yet powerful. He was not thinking about going back anymore. The idea of returning to his old life no longer felt like comfort. It felt like limitation. That realization surprised him. Just weeks ago, that same life had felt safe, reliable, almost necessary. But now, after everything he had experienced, it no longer fit who he was becoming. Later that day, Ethan went for a walk through the same streets he used to rush through every morning. This time, he moved slower, more aware of his surroundings. He noticed details he had ignored before. The sound of footsteps, the quiet conversations, the rhythm of life happening all around him. But more importantly, he noticed how he felt within it. There was still uncertainty about the future, still questions without answers. But the fear that once controlled him had changed. It no longer stopped him. It simply walked beside him, no longer in charge. As he passed the office building where he used to work, he paused for a moment. He looked up at the windows, remembering the countless hours he had spent inside, living a life that felt secure but incomplete. For a brief second, a thought crossed his mind. What if I had never left? The answer came quietly, without hesitation. I would still be there, wondering what my life could have been. Ethan stood there a little longer, not with regret, but with understanding. He realized that the hardest part of his journey had not been leaving his job or facing uncertainty. It had been confronting the truth about himself, the truth that he had been choosing comfort over growth for far too long. And once he saw that clearly, there was no going back. As the sun began to set, Ethan turned away from the building and continued walking, not toward a fixed destination, but toward whatever came next. He did not have a perfect plan. He did not have guaranteed success. But he had something far more important. He had the willingness to keep moving forward, even when the path was unclear. And in that moment, he understood something that changed everything. Freedom is not a place you arrive at. It is a decision you make again and again, every time you choose courage over comfort, every time you step into the unknown instead of hiding from it. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of that truth settle within him. His journey was far from over. In many ways, it had just begun. And somewhere ahead, beyond the uncertainty, there was a version of his life he had never seen before. The only question that remained was how far he was willing to go to find it.